So today we're kicking it off with a wonderful lecture that I've heard a little bit of this work before from Professor Brian Porter-Szucs, who is the Arthur Thurnow Professor of History here at the University of Michigan. I'll tell you a little bit about his work. He was born in Mercer, Pennsylvania. He received his PhD. You wrote it. He received his PhD. Never mind. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin in history, and he has been teaching here at the University of Michigan for over 20 years. I'll start by saying he is already a renowned and multiply awarded teacher. He is known as a very charismatic and interesting lecturer, but he's also was very much involved in bringing students into the classroom through writing blogs and using technology. At the same time, he directed the Copernicus Institute of Polish Studies here for a number, 10 years, so a lot of service here. And on top of that, he has written, co-authored one book and written 3 other books. I have a copy here, a beautiful book, Faith and Fatherland, Catholicism, Modernity in Poland, published in 2010. And the most recent, Poland in the Modern World, Beyond Martyrdom. And that theme of Beyond Martyrdom was the subject of I have to say, Brian also is quite a prolific writer and blogger and writes for different publications. And a blog he wrote about the refugee crisis was recently picked up by U.S. News and World Report. And in it, he is arguing this same thing, Poland Beyond Martyrdom, how Poland might consider itself no longer the victim, but actually quite a prosperous country that might consider welcoming refugees rather than being the country of emigration, right? We think of Poles all leaving Poland, and in this case, Poland is actually in a position, can reimagine itself as being in the position of welcoming them. So without further ado, I'd like you to welcome Brian Porter-Szucs.
Thank you. It's a wonderful introduction. It's wonderful to be introduced by Christy. She can at least pronounce my name, which is more than most people who introduce me. Let's say, as long as you don't say Porter-Szucs, I'm happy. Let me bring up my slides here. Okay, or not. There we go. All right. So, my goal today is modest. I hope in about a half hour, 40 minutes, to reframe our basic understanding of the economic debates of the second half of the 20th century. Throughout looking at the way those debates played out in a very specific country, Poland. The economists of the PRL, the Polska Rzeczpospolita Ludowa, or Polish People's Republic, understood the importance, in fact, the centrality of personal consumption. A lot of scholars recently, Christy among them, and many others, some of them who will be coming here later, have been talking a lot recently about consumption and consumerism in Eastern Europe. And when that scholarship began to come out, a lot of us were initially surprised. Oh, they had consumerism in socialism. Well, we shouldn't have been. Had we been paying attention to what the communists actually said about their own economy, we would have realized a long time ago that consumerism and consumption was actually very central to social economics from the earliest post-war years, as I'll talk about in a moment, even during the Stalinist era. The communist economists posited consumption and high levels of consumption as their primary objective. Not a secondary objective, but rather the key to what they were trying to accomplish. The proliferation of consumer goods in Poland, Hungary, and some of the other somewhat more prosperous East European countries in the 1970s wasn't some accidental byproduct of a modernization in a socialist form that wasn't anticipated. It wasn't, as it's sometimes been interpreted, some sort of bread and circuses strategy to pacify a restless population. No, it was the whole point of what they were trying to accomplish. But the way in which the men and women, well, the men, sorry, of the economics department and the policymaking offices of the Polish People's Republic positioned consumption within their broader world. Important distinctions from, and also, maybe even more importantly, some similarities with the way Western economists talked about consumption. Very much unlike their Western counterparts in the 50s and 60s, but very much like their counterparts in the late 70s and 80s. The economists of the PRL had a fundamentally supply-side economic vision that could only accommodate and tried to create rational economic actors. In other words, they always talked about consumption. That was something they were quite comfortable with. But what they could not talk about, in fact, even conceptualize clearly, was the irrationality, as they called it, of demand, consumer demand. So they were flummoxed by the cultural practices of consumption that emerged in the late 1970s, well, even in the late 1960s, really. But they were very well equipped to understand and engage with economic theories that arose in the late 1970s in the West of a supply-side orientation. Reorient our understanding of socialist economic thought in this way. It helps us, in a lot of ways, I think, it helps us globalize the story of it suggesting a sort of unified field theory of economics, at least, for the second half of the 20th century. And helps us study the shifts in those theories in new ways. I think even more importantly, it allows us to recast and rethink the Cold War. We're accustomed to thinking about this period of 1945, or 48, if you wish, to 1989 as a conflict between capitalism and socialism. I'm not going to pretend that wasn't important. That mattered, okay? But running alongside that was another competition, one which we're used to talking about, but only within capitalism. And that is the debate between supply-side and demand-side worldviews. In fact, that was a global story. Once we recognize that many of the fundamental assumptions about consumption were shared by the Chicago School and the Warsaw School, if I can call it that, central planners in Eastern Europe, and once we wrap our head around the irony of that, we can arrive at, I think, a fuller grasp of what actually happened in 1989. If we concentrate on the foundational assumptions in the sphere of economic theory, we can clearly see two sharply contrasting worldviews playing out in the second half of the 20th century. What complicates the story is that those two competing worldviews did not map out onto the competing sides of the Cold War, so the US and the USSR, and they cut across them. So what are those two sides? Well, on the one hand, in the immediate post-World War II era, most economists in the US and most economists in Western Europe shared a pair of linked assumptions about how the world worked. First assumption was that economic behavior was fundamentally irrational, governed by what Keynes called, in another context, the animal spirits. There was a fundamental irrationality to economic demand. And the second assumption, that that the goal of economic policy, the goal of being an economist, was to figure out how to harness that irrationality, harness that demand, harness that desire in ways that would lead to growth. That's one set of worldviews. On the other side, challenging that, was another worldview that began with two different assumptions. The first being that economic behavior, in fact, basically all behavior, was or ought to be, and that which of those verbs we use is tricky, and I'll talk about that later, but economic behavior is fundamentally rational. Ultimately, it can be understood in terms of a universalized rationality. And then that the goal of economic policy needs to be to figure out a way to maximize that rationality, primarily by concentrating resources in the hands of those who, in fact, best embody that rationality, and preventing those who are irrational from having access to economic policy decisions. In the first camp, that former camp, you have all the left liberal, social democratic politicians and economic thinkers of the 50s and 60s, and even a few dinosaurs later than that. In the latter camp were the Marxist economists and the supply-siders of the Chicago School. To be more precise, when I talk about concentrating resources in the hands of those who can best handle them, in the Marxist framework, they were committed to a general maximizing, a general equalizing, ultimately, of material well-being, but within structures of power and decision-making that they called democratic centralism, right, the Leninist term. They advocated the egalitarian distribution of wealth, yes, but the hierarchical and very inegalitarian distribution of policymaking authority. Polish economists were accustomed to planning for needs. They were very much not accustomed to planning for anything that escaped the rationality of their economic framework. So in the late 1970s, 1980s, many economists from Eastern Europe, mainly Poland, some Hungarians as well, a few others, those two are the countries that exported the most. Many economists from these countries came to the United States, studied in American economics departments as young scholars on Fulbright exchanges, other academic exchange programs that turned out to be one of our most effective weapons in the Cold War. And when they came over here, they found it hard to have much in common, to get a conversation going with what then would have been the senior faculty, who were Keynesian. But they found it very easy to talk to the people who were then the younger faculty, or fellow graduate students, who were supply-siders. They shared a lot. And ultimately, all these communist economists had to do when they got back home is take everything they learned in Chicago or New York or Cambridge and just drop the word socialism from what they used to say. By the 1980s, at least in Poland, they were more than happy to drop the word socialism. And everything else they learned abroad could be brought over pretty much whole cloth. Okay, let me elaborate this story a bit more. Back to the Stalinist era, back to the early 1950s, late 40s, early 50s. If we look at economic textbooks or planning documents, you see, the research for this project has been truly fascinating. I've been able to read one economic textbook after another from various time periods. I mean, try combining the writing of an economic textbook with the rhetoric of Stalinism. I do it, so you don't have to. If you look at the economic textbooks from the Stalinist era, they're actually more interesting than you'd think they would be. Of course, they're very tendentious in their prose style. But that actually helps us because it makes their assumptions very, very transparent. There's very little subtlety to Stalinist writing. So, if we cut through some of the cliches in that, it's cutting through a lot, we find some key assumptions about consumption that I've already summarized. Let me give you just one example. This is from a 1954 textbook by Józef Zawadzki. I'm giving you the Polish. I'll read the translation. So he writes this: Joseph Stalin formulated the basic characteristics and requirements of the fundamental economic laws of socialism in this way. to ensure the maximum satisfaction of the ever-increasing material and cultural needs of the entire society by means of uninterrupted growth and the improvement of socialist production based on the most advanced technology. An economic law of socialism, formulated in this way, demonstrates its deeply humanist character. The goal of production is the person and his or her needs. It sounds almost Catholic. The person. It is the satisfaction of his or her material and cultural needs. That verbiage is everywhere. And you can find it in book after book after book, speech after speech after speech. The key catchphrase here, the one I want to draw your attention to, is this phrase, the maximum satisfaction of the ever-increasing material and cultural needs of the whole society. In exactly that formulation, it appears again and again and again and again for the next 40 years in virtually every economic textbook you will read from Communist Poland. Most accounts of economic policy in the Stalinist era give you, I think, a slightly misleading picture, implying that economics during that time period, the plan during that time period, was aimed at what Stalin called primitive accumulation, what Marx called primitive accumulation, at the suppression of consumer goods in favor of steel mills, right? But we misunderstand what's going on if we don't recognize that that type of policy, the emphasis on heavy production, was always cast in their own writings, internal and for public consumption, in their own writings, as a means to an end. It was thought of as a means to an end. And the end was not how many tons of steel we can produce. The goal was the maximum satisfaction of blah, blah, blah. Of course they were convinced that Poland needed to rebuild as quickly as possible. But if you were standing in Warsaw in 1948, you didn't need to be a genius to figure out that rebuilding was a pretty important agenda item. And they recognized that Poland needed to industrialize, that a country that was, at that time, about 2/3 agrarian, was going to have problems in the 20th century. Again, you didn't need to be a Marxist or even, intelligent to recognize that. That was pretty obvious, and no one was going to disagree with it. So that regardless of your economic perspective, the emphasis on accumulation over consumption was going to be part of any economic policy after World War II. Okay. But they were convinced, even during the Stalinist era, that the point of it was to end that policy as quickly as possible so that you could start focusing on a consumer society, or at least a society of abundant consumption. I'll phrase it that way, it's better. So this view is much deeper than its Stalinist accoutrements that you see in a quotation like this. Very famous economist, Włodzimierz Brus, had a Stalinist moment, but wasn't really a Stalinist. He stressed the need for sacrifice in his writings of that time. Of course he did. He stressed the need of resisting American imperialism. Of course he did. But he always reassured his readers, writing back in those days, that socialism was distinguished from capitalism precisely because it prioritized the needs of the consumer, as opposed to capitalism. He put it this way. He said, the goal of capitalism is profit, he wrote, attained by means of exploitation of the working class, which leads directly to a decrease in the consumption capacity, and thus to a decrease in consumption among the masses. Socialism, in contrast to that, quote, not only gives people freedom, but simultaneously creates the conditions for a prosperous life. Now, after 1956, after the fall of the Stalinists, a lot of the elements of the Stalinist economic rhetoric were cast aside. Certainly Stalin himself wasn't quoted anymore in Poland. And the always Sisyphean quest for self-sufficiency and autarky, that was jettisoned. But what's more important, actually, is what wasn't changed, what didn't change. The desire to prioritize, at least rhetorically and theoretically, the provision of consumer goods to the individual. Now, what makes this tricky is that in the 1970s, Polish economists began to construct a straw horse that has proven to be remarkably enduring. And the straw horse was an image of the Stalinist economist. So when you start to read Polish economists from later times, they say, we, of course, are very different from our Stalinist predecessors because all they cared about were coal mines and steel mills. And we care about consumption. I'll give you an example. Stanisław Markowski was an economist for the state-run trade union apparatus, and he had a little book for internal use in the unions to teach the union activists a little bit about economics. And he wrote a book about consumption in 1972. And he wrote this. He wrote how, that in the Stalinist years, mistakes were made. Of course, lovely. In Polish, you can do the passive voice even if you don't try. It's just all over the place. Mistakes were made in this area, consisting of an inadequate recognition of the consumption needs of the population, alluding to the infamous and recently failed attempt to raise prices in 1970. Markowski criticized the misguided effort to balance the emerging economic disproportions exclusively by way of limiting the possibilities of improved consumption. So he's setting up a sort of false dichotomy between me, who I understand consumption matters, they, old guys, they didn't. But the truth is that he really hasn't changed the rhetoric at all. We too often actually have taken a lot of this at face value and assumed that his characterization of Stalinist economics was correct. It wasn't. That comparatively little actually shifted. These are some statistics from Markowski's own book there, Spożycie w Polsce Ludowej. And what you can see is that, yes, there are ups and downs, ebbs and flows of the amount of profit. And yes, socialist economies did have a concept of profit. The amount of profit that was devoted to accumulation and the amount that was redirected towards consumption. Okay? Obviously, they're going to define profit differently than we do. I'm not going to get into that right now. Anyway, you can see that there are ebbs and flows. But they're all in the single digits, the ebbs and flows, and they really don't map on to significant changes in standards of living. A little bit. There's a correlation, but it's weak. Okay? So the differences aren't trivial, but they're not fundamental. There really weren't that fundamental changes. The economists and policymakers then of the 70s were constructing a straw horse when, as Markowski wrote, consumption must not be treated, as it has often been treated in the past, as a burden which gets in the way of directing the national economy. Just compare Markowski's words with the words of Zawadzki, again, from the Stalinist era, from '54. Growing needs create demand for socialist production. Growing production permits a better and more comprehensive satisfaction of the needs of the population. For a socialist system, the domestic market has a decisive significance. It follows that socialist industry requires for its development the expansion of a domestic market and of aggregate demand for manufactured goods. Now, contained in that passage by Zawadzki is the core tension, I think, in the worldview of the PRL policymakers and economists, a certain slippage in terminology that you see a lot, especially by the 70s. A slippage between the words potrzeba and popyt, or need and demand. And they're actually very different concepts, but there's an elision between them in these economic writings. The word demand was discussed with increasing frequency throughout the 4 decades of the communist era, but it tended to be used very casually, without really thinking through what it meant. And very often, as here, it slides right into the concept of need. Underpinning virtually all the debates and the discussions of economic policy in the Polish People's Republic was a desire to assess what people needed, figure out what it meant to do that. Not just for sustenance, but also for personal satisfaction, for life fulfillment. We don't want to caricature their understanding of need. They thought about this and wrote about it a lot. What does it mean to need something? How do we define need? Is need different from one culture to another? These are things they worried about. These weren't simplistic people and they weren't stupid people. Okay? They did understand that need was flexible. But if you recognize that, then what do you do with this concept? It's really hard. In They would include a lot of things in the category of need, including things like what they called cultural needs, social needs, personal needs, even duchowe, spiritual needs, which in Polish doesn't necessarily mean a religious concept. They would talk about that too. I'll give you an example. 1955, Włodzimierz Glus, again, emphasizing what he called, quote, social forms of satisfying needs, including social insurance, paid leave, family allocations, education, culture, healthcare, maternal care and child care, vacations, construction of housing and of community facilities, etc. Right? So need, when we talk about need, we're not talking about, putting food on the table, although that's there too. But by the 60s, that's really not as much of an issue in Poland as addressing some of these other needs. In the 60s, Janusz Gorski wrote similarly that within the framework of socialist consumption, we will give an ever-growing preference to rational relaxation. There's a great term, and a term that is really at the heart of the intellectual bind that they found themselves in. Rational needs. It pointed to the fact that the PRL's economists and economic policymakers were every bit as enamored with the utility maximizing rational homo economicus as many present-day American economists would be. The homo economicus really didn't change much when he became homo sovieticus. He's really the same person. The only difference was that the object of efficiency maximization shifted from the firm in a capitalist context to society in the socialist context. And that's really the only change on the level of economic theory. And in fact, there's already been some work on this studying Hungarian and German socialist economists, pointing out that whether East Germany or West Germany, they were very, they often spoke of, the West German economists often spoke of socialism as a sort of ideal type that was the perfect rationalized system. It's like the firm writ large, and they liked that idea, even though they were opposed to socialism philosophically. Anyway, communist authors typically argued that capitalism was weak precisely because it could not cultivate the rational actor in the same way that a good socialist system could. Staying with Gorski here, he said, capitalism leads to the creation of an irrational structure of production from a society's point of view. Because the pursuit of profit would lead to activities that undermined what was rationally optimal. From the broadest perspective, he argued that capitalism was doomed to fail. In contrast, his text here continued, in a socialist system, economic activity is subordinated to genuine social needs. We want economic activity to be conducted in the most rational manner. Markowski, quoted him earlier, took a similar logic towards the policy choices faced throughout the socialist system. Though increased consumption will always have to be the goal of the socialist state, he wrote, this is 1972, if pay was allowed to rise too quickly, remember he's writing this to a union audience, he's saying, recognize that we're not going to increase your pay too quickly because that would weaken the interests of workers in increasing the efficiency of their labor. And more importantly, some of that consumption could assume an irrational nature. Eek. Now, in all the texts I've examined, and I should note, I'm still in the earlier stages of this. I got a lot more to do. But in everything I've studied so far, the Keynesian idea that high wages could actually stimulate growth was, by encouraging demand, right? That was dismissed out of hand. Either ignored as an argument or addressed and then made fun of as a very silly idea. 1963, the very famous economist Kazimierz Łaski gave a speech lecture at the Warsaw Center for Party Propaganda, and about Keynesianism. He addressed Keynesianism. And he contrasted Keynesianism with a socialist economy characterized by a shift in emphasis, when dealing with growth, from the factors of demand to the factors of supply. He derided his British counterpart, Keynes, for caring only about employment and production, and for believing that the purpose and utility of investment is unimportant. He's right. I mean, Keynes really didn't care about the purpose of investment. His famous example of, if push comes to shove, have a person dig a hole and fill it in again if it'll create a job and create demand. He made a much more complicated argument than that. But it's not entirely an inaccurate characterization of Keynesianism. Keynesian economists are not interested in whether an economic investment is good for, like, the universal welfare. I mean, be nice. But that's not what matters. It matters is the production of demand, the generation of demand. Bruce and Waske together wrote a textbook, jointly authored textbook in 1962, and they put it very nicely. They said, socialism brings Alice out of Wonderland, in which the existing material productive capacity and the unemployed labor force remains unutilized because of some supernatural lack of adequate aggregate demand. So the socialist economists felt that the concept of inadequate demand was silly. There's no such thing. Doesn't matter. If this sounds like supply-side economics, it is. And in fact, that's what they said. Same textbook. They said, a realistic model of growth for a socialist economy takes as a point of departure not the problem of aggregate effective demand, but the problem of the size of disposable factors for growth. And thus it accentuates above all the supply side. Strona podage. Right? As the factor limiting the size and tempo of the growth of production. So I'm not putting words in their mouths. These are supply-side economists. Okay? And they admitted it. They didn't see it as an admission. They were proud of it. This supply-side orientation entailed much more than a repudiation of consumer demand, although certainly that's part of it. Even more important was their repudiation and aversion to desire, to the irrationality of desire. This was the germ that they feared would really destroy them, and they were right. Gorski, quoted earlier, wrote this. Particular emphasis should be placed on creating the conditions for the development of the social being, educated and cultivated, integrated with society. Our model of consumption consciously rejects the subordination of the individual to the domination of objects, the desire to uncritically collect new goods, when the collecting becomes the goal, and the goods cease to be what they ought to be, that is, only means to make life easier, means to enable the free development of the individual. Again, it sounds awfully Catholic. Side note. I think Pope Francis would probably sign on to that statement. Passages like this can be quoted to illustrate a supposed communist aversion to consumption, but note that the problem is not with consumption, it is to the irrationality of desire. Rational consumption, rational relaxation, as he put it, is fine, but irrational, addictive, and that word comes up a lot, desire is a real problem. He insisted in this text that socialism was going to produce the sort of comfort that capitalism could, but it would do it by creating a rational individual, a utility maximizing rational individual, as opposed to one who was merely running around trying to buy the newest toy. Waske made the same point, even more clearly, back in his lecture on Keynesianism that I quoted a moment ago, in which he said that inadequate demand was inconceivable in a socialist economy because irrational desire would be replaced by rational understanding of need. Here's how he put it. This is why attention in the analysis of growth in a socialist economy is directed mainly towards supply, towards the growth of the means of production, and not towards demand. A socialist economy develops, therefore, with the goal of increasing the abundance of goods for the satisfaction of social needs. This goal defines the mobilization and utilization of the means of growth and delineates the tempo of growth. The phenomenon of limiting production because of insufficient demand doesn't arise. In 1974, a young economist named Ryszard Zabrzewski defended his habilitatia, something a little beyond a doctoral thesis, at the Communist Party's Higher School for Social Science. The title of the work was The Social Economic Aspects of Individual Consumption in Poland. very interesting document. So in this text, he criticized what he considered an overly simplistic understanding of that old slogan of maximizing the satisfaction of the material and cultural needs of the entire society. This couldn't be reduced just to the needs of consumption, he argued, because, quote, the subjective imaginings of consumers about their needs are often incompatible with the recommendations of science. For example, he said, desire can often lead to alcoholism, to drug addiction, to bad dietary habits, and a socialist economy could not devote itself towards meeting those needs. Those are irrational desires. They are harmful. Worse still, he wrote, were demands created by, quote, psychological and social factors, among which a critical role is played by fashions and other irrational motivations. This is a problem that's very hard to solve correctly. It's a great line. You're going to have to use that in the future, because he never goes on to solve it. He just says it's a really, really hard problem to solve. Yeah, it is. The difficulty came from Zabzhevsky's recognition that need was a difficult term to define because different societies had different needs. He recognized this. He understood that there were cultural differences and that these affected need, the concept of need. But he's already ruled out the idea of desire as a way of measuring that. So how do you figure that out? Well, of course, the answer was socialism solves it. It always does. Socialism could accommodate cultural difference without surrendering to irrationality. The solution, he said, was to, quote, prioritize the satisfaction of those needs of the individual that are in accord with social needs. This, in turn, he thought would create a new sort of demand, a higher level of demand. Here's how he put it. The development of culture and education, which has taken place here mainly thanks to the Social Consumption Fund, Społeczne Fundusze Spożywcze, has caused an acceleration of the growth of needs of a loftier kind, and as a consequence has awakened and cultivated the demand for books, magazines, cultural entertainment, etc. Probably, had these experiences not been financed by social consumption funds, the tempo and extent of the aforementioned growth would have been a lot less. Fair enough, if you ever went to a communist-era bookstore and saw, Mickiewicz and Slovatsky in abundance, right? But popular translated mystery novels or something in very short supply. Right? We're cultivating a higher sense. Now, in a lot of ways, everybody here, all these economists, when they get in these debates, they mischaracterize their opponents. We all do that. And in the way these authors characterize Keynesian economists, of course, they created a caricature of Keynes. But on a fundamental level, they really did identify something that really did distinguish them from Keynesian capitalists. That Keynesians of the 1960s, they really did revel in the sort of madman hucksterism, right, of the American 1960s. There's nothing wrong with Don Draper. He's a good guy in that framework. Lasky, for example, wasn't exaggerating when he claimed that the primary objective of that type of capitalism was to expand consumption as much as possible, regardless of the utility of what was produced. Now, the populations of Eastern Europe, again, particularly Hungary and Poland, started to really get a taste for this kind of stuff in the late 60s and 1970s. But just as they were getting a taste for that kind of capitalism, the winds blowing from the West started to shift. Supply-side capitalism abandoned the promise of universal hedonism for jeremiads about austerity. Whereas once American foreign policy was dedicated to the cultivation, or conquest as it might be, of foreign markets, there arose an ever-intensifying quest for the acquisition of low-cost foreign producers. It's a major shift in American foreign policy. In this new incarnation of capitalism, the economists of the capitalist world merged almost seamlessly with some of the trends that were happening in the socialist world. And as I said, all the socialists eventually had to do was drop the word socialism, and they found they were all in the same book. a fascinating figure in this transition. There's one person who I found who kind of embodies this eventual merger. And it's a man named Kazimierz Poznański. Is an economist. He's trained at the University of Warsaw. He left Poland after the declaration of martial law in 1981. He had a number of temporary positions at very prestigious American universities. He was at Cornell for a while. He was at Northwestern for a while. Eventually settled into a tenured position at the University of Washington. He has served as a consultant for the World Bank, for the U.S. Congress, for the United Nations, returned to Poland for a while as a stint at the position of Vice Minister of Finance in 94 to 96. Fascinating character. He was an opponent of the PRL. He left with the declaration of martial law in 1981. And after 1989, he was initially very enthusiastic about the Third Polish Republic, eventually became rather critical of that state as well. The grounds for his criticisms, though, are quite consistent and quite interesting. Professor Poznański's basic analysis was set out, well, in a lot of places, but my favorite is this one. The book, now an English language book, Poland's Protracted Transition, 1996. And it offered a sweeping analysis of why communism had just fallen. Perhaps surprisingly, he believed that the main weakness of socialism wasn't the inability to improve rates of consumption. No, quite the contrary, he said. It was precisely the fact that they tried to increase rates of consumption. That was the problem. Because the Communist Party under Gierek in the 1970s, under Edvard Gierek, was so weak, Poznański argued, it was unable to prevent strikes. It was unable to hold down wages. So that throughout the 1970s, and I'm quoting from his book now, wages were allowed to outstrip yearly productivity increases, causing diversion of exportables to the domestic market. Gierek's infamous foreign loans, which are often pointed to as this huge policy mistake, Poznański actually liked that idea. He said that was a good thing. You borrow the money, that's fine, nothing wrong with that. But the problem with the loans was that they were used to increase living standards and not used to invest in exportables. He saw two missed opportunities in the PRL, two moments when the Communist Party could have really saved itself and shown it was worthy of holding power. The one happened in 1976, and the other happened in 1981. Now, those dates are going to be familiar to any Pole. 1976 was the suppression of a strike in Radom. 1981, of course, the declaration of martial law. Poznański approved of both of those moves, using troops against the strikers and declaring martial law. That's a good thing. The problem is that following up on that, both Gierek and then Jaruzelski were unable to trim consumption adequately, allowing wages to eventually go back up again so that, quote, the export capacities created under Gierek were just allowed to deteriorate. It was only finally with the reforms of Leszek Balcerowicz in 1989 that a, quote, reduction in real wages and their relative stability afterwards could then help to energize exports. At the root of Poznański's worldview is a desire for privately managed economies. He's a capitalist. But why does he like private property? Well, the reason is actually delightfully clear in this book. I love the lack of obfuscation. He's quite honest. He said, quote, that privacy is not, that private property is not a goal unto itself. Individual liberty is not a goal. Actually, sometimes it gets in the way. But rather, quote, under conditions of private property, personal freedom and property, individuals perform best, i.e. they are most economical. So we become most rational when we have private property, and therefore we're most like the economist's model of the Homo economicus under private property. Therefore, private property is better. So the goal of any economic system should allow that to thrive. Socialism, he said, was unable to establish such rationality because workers were, quote, too concerned about protecting their newly acquired higher standard of living. And because the Communist Party had lost its ability to control such a critical economic variable as wages. And that wages just kept going up and people started living better, and that was the failure of communism. As a counterexample, he's not all critical. He has some counterexamples of where it's done right. His counterexample of a properly functioning socialist economy is Romania. In Romania, at no time was the Romanian bureaucracy shaken to the point of losing its ability to manage the economy. Romania's state machinery, therefore, was, quote, in a position to force enterprises to export more while using fewer imports. Now, to be sure, the standard of living in Romania was pretty awful, but he said, quote, they are more historically backward anyway, so it doesn't matter. Okay, in sum, the strength of any economic system, according to Professor Poznański and his like, can be measured in terms of the power of the coordinating mechanisms and the stability of the property structures. By this standard, he approved of Stalinism. He approved of Stalinism because, quote, as long as people were terrorized or indoctrinated by the official ideology of sacrifice, the political center, the single leader or narrow party circle, had sufficient means to enforce proper economic behavior by state enterprises with respect to assets entrusted to them. Unfortunately, it couldn't last. Stalin fell. And eventually that led to the detriment of the economy as a whole, but, quote, the workers were the winners. Of course, they're the enemy, right? The workers. Once wages began growing faster than productivity, he said, workers' motivation suffers, which actually we heard just a moment ago, didn't we, from the communist author, and, quote, the economy's ability to divert resources to capital stock expansion might be eroded. Poznański's vision might seem the polar opposite of socialism, although his fondness for Stalin, I think, is quite revealing. Certainly, the ethical foundations, to put it euphemistically, are somewhat different. No question. Instead of a desire to improve living standards, he offers a means to maximize productivity and enable what he considers proper, his word, economic behavior to arise. But despite the differences between someone like Kazimierz Poznański and the economists like Włodzimierz Brus or Kazimierz Łaski, despite their differences, there is a fundamental common element. In both cases, we see an attempt to replace the chaos of demand-driven growth with its reliance on unchecked and uncontrollable and unplannable, worst of all, desire, right, with a system of control capable of suppressing wages enough so as to maximize the accumulation of profit and to improve supply, which is the fundamental variable in this worldview. The Stalinists were able to do that because of the oppressive apparatus they had, and because after World War II, there was just people were willing to sacrifice in the name of Reconstruction. That was, there was some genuine willingness there. But that couldn't last long. Neither violent force nor suppression of desire could last more than a few years, and the communist economists could never figure out what to put in its place. They could never figure out what mechanism could be put in the place of terror that could maximize economic growth in a supply-side system. Because fundamentally, they were trying to mix two things that couldn't be mixed. They were trying to mix a commitment to improving standards of living with a fundamentally supply-side worldview, which is not about improving standards of living. It's about improving economic growth and the accumulation of supply of economic means of production in the hands of those rational enough to manage it. It was only the transformation of 1989 that could allow accumulation, capital accumulation, to resume. And only then could Homo economicus really arrive in Poland. Now, stepping back, we can see that this did, no question, 1989 did mark the defeat of socialist economics. But what defeated socialist economics was not the opponent they were fighting in the 1950s or the 1960s. What defeated supply-side socialism was supply-side capitalism in a development that was disconcertingly Hegelian under the circumstances. The thesis of demand-side Keynesian capitalism confronted the antithesis of supply-side socialism in the early years of the Cold War. They both lost. To emerge the thesis, the new thesis, the synthesis, of supply-side capitalism. This victorious formation combined the rational economic actor of socialism with the property regime of capitalism and the economic policy of austerity. The promise made in different forms by both of the old foes, the promise to maximize satisfaction of ever-increasing material and cultural needs, that was the true loser, and that was and seems to be gone forever. Thank you very much. So I take it we have time for questions.
About half an hour for questions.
Super. Sir.
Thank you, Professor, for that really fascinating lecture. I take it then that if you could time travel back into the late 40s all the way up to, let's say, 1960 in Poland, you're not going to see commercials like that from
No. No.
all through your lecture, I was thinking about what if there was that type of infusion of Don Draper type mentality.
Yeah.
So what were the commercials like? If you opened up a magazine in Poland, what was it like for farm tools? What
Well,
were the commercials like?
We used to think, well, there was no advertising in communism. Well, actually, there is. There is actually a dissertation done here, I think it was 97, 98, by Patrick Patterson, some of you might remember Patrick, showed that, in fact, there was a robust advertising industry in Eastern Europe. It was a very different kind of advertising industry. So the goal of advertising cannot be Don Draper. You cannot have Don Draper, okay? Because, Don Draper's whole philosophy is figure out what people want and give it to them, right? Capture the emotion. Harness the irrationality. Remember the slideshow scene from season 1. Sorry. This is a person who revels in irrationality, right? Because Keynesian capitalism does. That is totally unacceptable. That cannot come into the communist world without just totally eroding it. Now, it did, and that's why it eroded. But in the earlier years, if you did see these advertisements, and they're really quite funny, they're advertisements for stores that have a total monopoly. So it's like an advertisement for something, and there's no choice. It's not like you could buy something else. But when you read the advertising literature, it turns out, because there were journals of advertising, and it turns out that the purpose of advertising is to promote rational consumption. Right? So, for example, I wish I could have brought it here. There's a famous poster of advertising the Fiat 126P, best car ever made, the Maui Fiat. That's sarcasm. The advertisement was, promoting this car. Now, any of you remember the communist era in Poland, there basically were no other cars, so that was the car you were going to get if you were lucky, and it was a years-long waiting list. It was really hard. But the advertisement said, and its big slogan, I'm not drinking anymore, so I can save money for a Fiat 126. Right? To promote rational consumption. Yeah. Yeah, Stephanie.
So, thank you for this interesting talk. I was wondering how, if at all, the re-narrating the Great Depression comes into this, because that seems to be such an important part of how the supply-demand side debates take place in the US or West Germany. Does that come in, like thinking back to that time and causation in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, the Great Depression, right, for socialist economists is piece of evidence number one. And it's a crisis of overproduction. Now, of course, a Keynesian economist will say, well, overproduction, that means inadequate demand, right? The socialist economists, of course, would never take that step, but they would say instead that, demand is the constant, and that it was just wild and overproduction, and then, the very fact that, and this is, you can see this in Engels and Marx, if you go, it's in Capital, that capitalism will always have crises of overproduction because of the quest for profit will always try to get more entrants into the market. They will produce more. That will lead to overproduction. That will lead to a crash. Recover, and you always have this up and down, up and down, up and down. So the Great Depression fit into their story. They just didn't take it the step beyond to see that maybe it was demand that could be the fluid variable. Right? Yes. All right.
Supply-side capitalism functions on the basis of an ever-expanding debt. Is there anything in supply-side socialism about creditor debt that helps explain it?
So, obviously by the 70s, they have to start thinking about debt. Initially, so if you look at the earlier stuff, the earlier books, they would say that under socialist system, we do not have a debt-driven economy. It's precisely our ability, because we are truly democratic, to rally the people to voluntary steps to limit consumption and emphasize accumulation to maximize future investment. Which works really well up until, about 1960 or so. And then they quickly realized that they just cannot accumulate enough to allow for future growth. So if you look at the overall growth of the economy in Poland, you can see that it goes up, 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 in fact, very, very steeply. They're doing very well, actually, in terms of aggregate economic measures, whichever one you choose, until about 1970 or so. At which point, the problem is that they've reached the limit. The only way they can continue to grow is to find some means for investment. And there's no mechanism for investment other than the withdrawal of surplus labor value, as they would conceptualize it. And the problem is after 1970 and the strikes in Poland of 1970 and the fact that it needed a military attack on the city of Gdańsk to suppress those strikes, after that point they couldn't risk forced austerity anymore at all. So in that, and Posnański was right. From the 70s on, they really did have to emphasize pretty much everything that, they were devoting lots and lots of their resources to consumer goods and very little to investment accumulation. Of course, there was one other, just at that moment, there appears on the stage another source of possible investment income, Western banks, who are willing to loan them the money. And so at this point, they conceptualize this, they try to conceptualize this, but they don't like it. The economists didn't like it. They basically said, and I need to look into this more. I even have the documents. I just haven't gone through them yet, I'm afraid, from the Planning Commission in the early 70s when they actually are trying to grapple with, oh, wow, we got all this new investment money that we really didn't ask for, but, Garrick has done it, so what are we going to do with it? And they said the only way we can save ourselves here is to make sure that this money goes towards new production, that it is investment in future growth. Of course, they couldn't say, if it goes to consumer demand, if it goes to consumer goods, it'll create demand, which we can then meet, which can then lead to growth, because they didn't have mechanisms for that. So the economists didn't like that. Supply-side socialists didn't like that at all. And the only way debt-driven growth could happen is if it all went towards increasing the supply, basically. Sir?
So, what sort of relationships do you have between your people, Polish and the sort of Soviet side, like Moscow School economists, Soviet Academy of Sciences? I mean, is there some kind of polemic going on there too?
No polemic. Yeah, that you don't do, right? So that gets tricky. So Soviet economists are translated and quoted abundantly in the 1950s. Then they cease to exist. Okay, I mean, of course they're still. I mean, I'm sure that they are still paying attention to what's going on in the Soviet Union, obviously, but the shift in Polish intellectual culture after 1956 inside the party is very strong, and you know, if you look at what they're saying, not publicly, but in their own meetings, it's always, you know, we must show fraternal solidarity to our Soviet brothers because they're our best protection against German revisionism. But in terms of like modeling ourselves after them, I mean, come on, we're Poles, they're Russians, we're European, they're barbarians. That attitude is in the party as much, maybe more, than it is outside of it. Yeah, so no, I don't see evidence of them paying much attention to the Soviets after '56. Yeah.
That was really interesting, great. And I think it helps shed light on the fondness of neoliberalism for authoritarian states in our own world.
Yeah. Yep.
So that was nice. Well, a couple of things. In the United States, there is a anxiety about this consumer culture too that drives, in some ways, with the Polish economists and their Keynesian linking it with the affluent society and these sorts of things about anxieties about this demand that can never, you know, because its desire can never be met and is always increasing and is corrupting and in these sorts of ways unsustainable. I have two questions. One's kind of basic, but instead of posing this as theoretical, what if you take this, you know, the root of this in the Great Depression and say the problem in the East is a supply problem, and the problem in the West is a demand problem. Like it's at that sort of a material level, and that they're focusing on what the real problems are. The second, totally different question is, in my work in the United Nations, I have this impression that there's a bunch of Poles having a very strong influence that's not really remarked on.
We're everywhere.
But in the development world.
Yeah.
And if you see these people coming in and spreading, you know, this is kind of one of the paths that, how much is that a two-way flow of ideas coming in through these international organizations into Poland? It seems to be coming out of Poland to me and really having a lot of appeal in UN development agents.
Interesting. Well, I mean, the Polish case is, you know, every developing economy would love to be able to believe that the Polish case is replicable, right? I mean, my gracious, Poland is, as I've been arguing elsewhere, it's a first world country now. I mean, it's kind of a poor first world country, but it's a first world country. If you look at this is just an aside, but if you look at the inequality adjusted Human Development Index, which is one you really should pay attention to, not the basic HDI, but the inequality adjusted HDI, which looks, you know, you find that the United States is just 2 positions ahead of Poland. We are 5th on the list if you look at the base HDI, 28th if we look at the inequality adjusted HDI. Poland is more or less the same in both measures because they have a much better Gini coefficient. Anyway, so they're really successful, incredibly successful. Why? Well, so to answer your specific question, the Poles have been, Polish economists were among the few groups in Poland in 1989 who already spoke English. If you look at the circle of professional economists, academic economists, with greater or lesser degrees of fluency, but yeah. And so they were really well positioned to start to participate right away in all sorts of international institutions, and they did so because they could get a lot more money than they could in Poland at that time. Not so true anymore, but still. Well, still. And so that's one reason why you see this flood of, particularly in economics, you see this flood of Poles appearing everywhere. And I think the other reason now, more recently, is just simply their incredible success, and so people want them. They're in demand. But it is an irrational demand. in a way, mainly because I think a lot of the advice that these Polish economists are giving, the ones who are most prominent in the international stage, is a misreading of the history. It seems to me that the Polish success story is largely due to the fact that they had so many years of such incredible ineffective governance. And what I mean by that is that throughout the 1990s, throughout all of Eastern Europe, as we all know, there was this incredible hegemony of this what we call neoliberalism, right? This of austerity economics, of a very almost blind faith in libertarian capitalism. And in many East European countries, and I think maybe here the Soviet Union is the greatest example, the idea that, well, the state should just disappear was kind of embraced. In Poland, the ideology was also embraced, but the governments were changing every 6 months, and they could never do it. And so privatization was very slow and very partial, and the immiseration of the population was slow. They didn't succeed in making people as poor as they hoped to. Okay, I'm being facetious, but only a little. So you see in 1990, 1991, a massive drop in almost any measure of living standards in Poland, in terms of whether you're measuring consumption or income or whatever. Unemployment skyrockets, of course. But then by 1993, 94, they abandon all those policies because of government turmoil, and they never really adopt them again. So they talk a good libertarian game, but they don't actually put it into practice. So they maintain a strong consumer market in Poland by relatively high wages. Now, any Pole is going to tell me that I have just, I don't know what I'm talking about. Poles make, on average, 1/3 what Germans make. They do not have high wages. But if you read what the economists were saying in 1990, the wages should have gone even lower. Leszek Porter-Szucs said famously in an early interview that someday, if everything goes right with shock therapy, now this won't happen till long in the future, but someday we might have living standards equal to those in Portugal. That was what he said when he was adopting the shock therapy plans. So had this agenda gone through as planned, that was his long-term objective. Actually, now Poland is quite a bit more prosperous than Portugal, okay? Mostly because he was hounded out of office rather quickly. He also said once that his only big mistake in terms of policy, he was asked, did you ever make a mistake? Of course, he is not going to admit he made a mistake. But he said that once he did cave into political pressure and allowed unemployment insurance to continue to exist. If only that could have been eliminated too, he said there could have been more incentives for hard work. And the Polish economy would be truly functioning properly. So anyway, now Porter-Szucs is very much in demand in certain lecture circuits. Certain lecture circuits, which I need not name. No, I wasn't going to say that. No, but that's an interesting thing because he still retains a popularity because he is credited, his name is associated with this Polish success story. But it's precisely because he failed that Poland is a success. That's my editorializing. Okay, that's different, but yeah. Christy. Oh.
Thanks so much. I am so glad that you did the reading on these texts. I'm digesting of them. I have a question about the moral dimension of the story that you're telling. Because I'm really struck by the specter of the irrational that appears in these texts and all of the different kinds of behavior and emotions that can go into what's not supposed to be happening and
Yeah.
cultivating. And so I'm wondering if, as your story is encouraging us to think differently about what the Cold War is a struggle between, if it's not exactly socialism versus capitalism, not in that way. So is there a shifting in the moral dimensions?
Oh, that's interesting. you're probably all familiar with the Stalinist invective, the decadent West, right? So clearly, I mean, that's the fear of irrational capitalism and irrational consumption. It's mapped onto older rhetorics of East-West, Russian exceptionalism. You can go a long way there, but it has a certain socialist tinge. What happens later? Well, I think that some of these texts from the 70s that I was quoting actually suggests that that never goes away. That so I can't prove this part, but I think that by the 70s, you have a lot of these sort of mid-level party officials, directors of firms and government officials, things like that, who are now enmeshed in the global economy. They're traveling to the West to do business. They're receiving Westerners and doing business with them. And you know, they are doing pretty well by Polish standards. They've got a, you know, at least a Maluk and maybe even, I don't know, a Serenka or something, you know, they've got a car. And they have an apartment, they have a dacha, you know, they're living the high life. And then they, you know, travel over to Berlin and, you know, and suddenly they feel really, really poor and very unfashionable. And, you know, there are two ways you can respond to that, right? You can respond to that by saying, I am morally superior, and I think some do, and I think that in the 50s and 60s they all would have. But I think plenty of them, and I think we've seen some evidence of this. If you know, when we had our 15 years ago, when we commemorated the 10th anniversary of the Round Table here, and we had all those communist officials talking about why they gave up power, some of the comments that some of them made were that we were getting sick and tired of looking so unfashionable when we traveled to Frankfurt. You know, and so, you know, so the moral dimension, I think, comes into play, and then it doesn't, right? And then that's part of the problem. It's hard to be a communist unless you actually accept the ethical position of socialism. You know, once you abandon that, it's kind of hard to sustain it.
I just was going to quickly build on that. I think some of that ethos or that the sense of communism did travel to larger masses and how it was absorbed with just the common folk. Having grown up in 1980s Yugoslavia and then being transplanted into the United States in my late teens, I mean, I am kind of living the rational, I'm an example of the rational consumer in the capitalism, inside capitalism.
Right.
I find myself struggling with those, just kind of having to justify my views in this economy. So
Yeah.
in some ways, I don't know, it was present and it was really
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it did. I think it also, you know, if you think about this, it really turns over the old idea of the Protestant work ethic. Because actually, if we all had this ethic, this morality of consumption, capitalism wouldn't go anywhere, right? If Poland had just been Protestant, it maybe would have succeeded. There's the problem. Those Catholics, they have irrational desires. Yeah, Christy.
My question's, I think we have time for just, well, I'll be quick. Thank you for the talk, but it's related to what Jess was asking, and that is, I was interested in a couple things about this homo economicus, both the overlaps and in some ways the differences between them. One of the dimensions being the gendered one, which I'm sure you found where women are much more irrational and not good models of the socialist economic actor, but also how the rational economic actor works for Gary Becker, and how, I mean, there must be quite different ways of getting ideologically to the rational economic actor in a socialist context versus Gary Becker kind of.
Yeah. Well, first, oh gosh,
Yeah, I mean,
you know, the gendered aspect is really interesting, and I've definitely been looking for it. And you expect it, right? You say, oh, well, of course, there's a figure of the irrational consumer, must be a woman. Actually, it's not. At least not what I've seen so far.
In Hungary it is.
In Hungary it is?
Yeah, there are lots of debates about refrigerator socialism and women who get their work because they want a refrigerator, not because they want to help.
You see those same lines, but they want their car, and that's a guy. But mostly when they're talking about irrational consumption, there is some discussion of fashion, although which is kind of gendered, obviously, but not entirely so, and not obvious, not quite as mapping it. And I have to look more as to exactly what the context of the use of the word moda is, fashion in this case. But more commonly, the biggest concern, if you look at the policy documents, not so much the theoretical ones, but the policy documents, the planning office stuff, they're worried about alcoholism. They're worried about alcoholism. They're worried about people spending too much money on tobacco. They weren't that expensive, but still. They're worried about addictive behaviors. They worry about coffee, which they don't have a very good supply of, so it's very expensive. And these things tend to be gendered male in Poland. So it's a really interesting thing, but I haven't seen it, at least not explicitly identifying the figure of the female consumer as the main danger. And this might be the difference between Hungary and Poland. Hungary was much richer, and at that point in time, and they had more consumer goods, and they had more household consumer goods. It's kind of hard to be complaining about the woman wanting a dishwasher when there are no dishwashers to buy, right? So maybe it's that. I don't know. That's something to look into. Yeah. Oh,
All right.
we're out of time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Great.